Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified. Here we have taken important articles that has featured in the Hindu and the weekly articles of the Indian Express. We have analyzed these articles as per demands of civil services examination. The topics for the discussion are listed on your screen. Moving on to this article of the day, the article has featured on page 1 of the Hindu and basically talks about the sideline meeting between the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Now, the sideline meeting happened at the G7 summit that was organized in Hiroshima, Japan this year. In this meet, Prime Minister Modi highlighted that India will do everything that is necessary to resolve the war in Ukraine. Further, the shortened Quad summit also happened. We have discussed the Quad in detail in our previous discussion under the DNS. During this discussion, we will keep our focus on the G7 as a grouping. What are the challenges that the G7 today faces? And what is the possible way forward for both India as well as for the G7? Now, UPSC under the GS2 syllabus talks about international relations and particularly talks about the international organization, and G7 is one of the prominent international organizations that has been in news. First, we will discuss the key decisions that were taken at the Hiroshima summit. At the Hiroshima summit, an action statement was released calling for resilient global food security with partnership among the member countries to address the needs today and into the future. Further, there was a reassurance for partnership for global infrastructure and investment, that is the $600 billion to be financed for promoting quality infrastructure, which is seen as an alternative to Chinese Belt and Road Initiative as an initiative by the G7 member countries. The G7 member countries has also reiterated their support for the free and open Indo-Pacific region and calls for principles that are safeguarding sovereignty, territorial integrity, and for the peaceful resolution of disputes in this region. Further, at the G7 summit, the member countries also condemned the war of aggression by Russia against the Ukraine. And at the last, the G7 leaders have also highlighted Hiroshima vision on the nuclear disarmament, wherein the G7 leaders have expressed their concern to achieve a world without the nuclear weapons with undiminished security for all. Now, if we look at the G7 grouping began in 1975 with meeting of leaders of US, UK, West Germany, Italy, Japan and France. And these member countries participated in the meeting because of the oil crisis and the global currency exchange issues that were prevalent at that point of time. Now, G7 group is basically an informal group of 7 countries today and hold an annual summit with the European Union and other invitees. India has been a special invitee to the G7 on several occasions in the past 2 decades. It is to understand here about G7 that G7 has no legal existence, permanent secretariat or official members. So this brings us to the question that the organization dating back to 1975 and having Western nations as the important members, what are the challenges today that the G7 faces? Now, analyzing the challenges, it is to be understood that today the G7 faces threefold threat, that is ideological, geopolitical and economical threat. We'll analyze them one by one. The first challenge that the G7 as a grouping faces is the changing economic situation. As when the G7 was constituted, the G7 member countries accounted for close to 2/3 of the global GDP. However, today the G7 countries account for less than 1/3 of the global GDP. And the grouping does not include emerging countries or the emerging 7 like countries like Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, Mexico, Turkey and Russia. So the economic situation of the G7 member countries have changed and there is a need for inclusion of emerging countries or the emerging 7 countries into the grouping, as the economic might of these countries has increased in the past few decades. The next challenge that the G7 today faces is that it is the world's first elite club, meaning thereby the G7 today still remains an elite club of Western nation and does not include countries like that of India or China who have emerged as the major economic players. Further, G7 has also caused the increase in polarization, With China and Russia being kept out of the G7 grouping, there is a growing polarization where the two countries have partnered with each other. The ties between the Russia and China has further strengthened and decreased the importance of G7 as a grouping. Another criticism of G7 is that it sidelines the economic issues as all the member countries of G7 are military partners. And being military partners, it is often argued that the economic issues are being sidelined, and it is also testified by the fact as G7 has failed to counter the economic downturn of 2007 or the subprime crisis, and which has led to the rise of G20. Further, G7 is also criticized as it has missed the contemporary important issue. It has missed the contemporary important issues like that of COVID, pandemic, climate change, and the challenges by extreme organization or the militant organization like that of IAS and disturbance in the West Asian region. Further, the G7 is also criticized for having no concrete plans. The G7 member countries have announced that they would phase out all fossil fuel and the subsidies, but there is no concrete plan till date for the same. The next thing to understand about G7 is that G7 has no formal institutions with a charter or a secretariat, and this is also highlighted as one of the criticism for the organization. And last problem that the G7 today faces is the internal challenges by the member countries themselves, as it was seen by the criticism of the former US President Donald Trump, who challenged the unity of G7 members as by stating that US allies have took the advantage of the United States. So these were the challenges that the G7 grouping today faces, and it is also the reason why G20 has emerged as an alternative to the G7 because of their increased membership, which are aligned with the geopolitical realities of the world today. So this brings us to the question that what can be done such that the position of G7 can be strengthened or G7 as a grouping does not lose its importance and relevance. There is a need for a new mechanism to handle the emerging global challenges today that may deal in the areas of trade war, economic slowdowns, or even covering the issues related to political turmoil. All these challenges need to be addressed through a new mechanism. The second thing that can be done to make the G7 work is the need for inclusion of the 7 future leading economies in the G7 fold, and that will include countries like India, Indonesia, Mexico, Brazil, Turkey, etc. Further, the G7 also needs to come out with the effective solutions to the burning issues like that of Ukrainian war, the global economic slowdown, Iran's nuclear program, the peace and stability issue in Afghanistan, and also the important problems that the countries of Gulf and West Asia faces today. Further, there is also a need to ensure India's role. It is seen that the US-China rivalry has stepped up in the Indo-Pacific region, and India can thus benefit from the partnership with the G7 member countries in the Indo-Pacific region, as the G7 member countries in this summit also called for a rules-based order. India can also step up its partnership with the members of the ASEAN countries, as even during this summit, the member countries of G7 called for a rules-based Indo-Pacific order with primary focus on ASEAN centrality. Thus, India can utilize G7 as a forum to further its interest in the Indo-Pacific region and to promote the partnership with the ASEAN member countries and boost partnership with countries like that of Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa, etc. And at the last, what India needs to do is to play the role of a balancing power between the West and with the countries like Russia and China, thereby not deteriorating its relationship with the traditional allies like Russia, inviting hostilities by partnership with the Western countries from China, and at the same time use the G7 bloc to further its interest in the Southeast Asia and with the other Western economies. So this was the way forward to keep G7 relevant. Apart from that, we have also seen what India can do to maintain its partnership to play a balancing role with the G7 and use multi-alignment as the guiding principle of its partnership not only with G7 but also with other countries. With this, we have seen what were the developments that took place at the G7 summit. We have also seen that what are the challenges that the G7 grouping today faces and the way forward plus the roadmap for the India during our discussion. Moving on to the next article of the day that has featured on 17th May in the Indian Express basically talks about the new Washington consensus that has been in news for some time. Now, the Prime Minister Modi in the previous week has attended G7 summit at Hiroshima and is expected to do bilateral visits to Washington and Paris in the month of June and July. Now, the primary agenda among the visits of Prime Minister Modi will be the restructuring of the global economic order and the growing convergence of interests between New Delhi and Washington. In this regard, the new Washington consensus becomes important for us because of the partnership that is to be developed between India and United States. Now, UPSC under GS2 syllabus talks about international relations with primary focus on bilateral relations, and the new Washington consensus and the properties under it will be important for development and strengthening of further relationship between India and United States. Before starting our discussion on what are the key ingredients of the new Washington consensus as given by the United States, we'll try to understand what was the Washington consensus. Now, in the 1980s, many of the Latin American countries faced debt and economic crisis. And to solve this crisis, Washington consensus came into existence. This Washington consensus was formulated by the experts at the IMF and the World Bank along with US Treasury to help the recovery from the debt crisis, and it involved principles like that of fiscal policy discipline. Now, under the fiscal policy discipline, there was adherence to avoid any large fiscal deficit as a percentage of GDP, meaning thereby the fiscal deficit as a percentage of GDP should be decreased to the minimum level. The second point that was advocated under the Washington consensus was the redirection of public spending from subsidies. Now, the public spending was to be redirected from subsidies towards pro-growth and pro-poor services like that of primary education, healthcare and infrastructure. The third reform suggested under the Washington consensus was the tax reform and broadening of the tax base by adopting moderate marginal tax rates. The fourth was interest rates that were to be market determined. The next thing under the Washington consensus was a competitive exchange rate that was to be adopted. Trade liberalization was also supported, under which there was focus on elimination of quantitative restrictions like requirement of licenses and other trade protection mechanisms like tariff and the other non-tariff barriers. So trade was to be liberalized to increase the trade between the countries. There was also liberalization of foreign direct investment. Privatization was to be concluded of the state enterprises, meaning thereby the state control was to be decreased. Deregulation was to be carried out, meaning thereby abolition of any regulations that may impede the market entry or restrict competition. And legal security for property rights was to be adopted. So these were the 10 points that were recommended under the Washington consensus. And if we have analyzed this era of 1980s and the 1990s, we can see that India also adopted some of the policies as under the Washington consensus, which we popularly known as the LPG reforms, when India faced a severe economic crisis. The LPG reforms that India carried out also had the angle of deregulation, liberalization, privatization and the globalization, which included all the measures related to narrowing of public spending, liberalized trade, privatization of trade, and basically the rollback of the state from the business sphere. And India in the post-LPG era witnessed high growth rates. However, after the decades of Washington consensus being adopted and advocated by US, now the Washington consensus today faces a lot of issues, and that is the reason why US is pushing for a new Washington consensus. The first issue that the Washington consensus faced was the conviction that the market knows the best approach. Now, this market knows the best approach led to the hollowing out of US industrial base. As US has pointed out that in the name of oversimplified market chain, the entire supply chain of strategic goods along with the industries and the jobs moved to the overseas. And it was realized that though This moving of the supply chain to overseas countries like that of China helped US become an export powerhouse, but at the same time it did not create any significant job or capacity. The next issue that the US highlighted in the present Washington consensus is the notion that all growth was good growth. And US has pointed out that the Washington consensus that believed in all growth as good growth has led to some sectors being privileged over other sectors. And this has led to a secondary treatment to the essential sectors like that of semiconductors, the shortage of which was seen during the present COVID crisis. And the third reason highlighted by the US to move away from the Washington consensus is the assumption that economic integration would make nations more responsible and open, and the global order would be more peaceful and cooperative. Now, Washington consensus was floated with this assumption in mind. However, United States has now observed that the Washington consensus had led to distortion wherein the countries like China, who follows a non-market economy, were inducted in international institutions like WTO. The inclusion into WTO must have incentivized them to adhere to the rule-based order. But this has not happened, as it can be seen with the aggressive rise of China. As China has gained the economic might, now it is flexing its muscle in the other geopolitical domain also through its Belt and Road Initiative or its complete disregard for the rules-based order in the South China Sea. Thus, these issues were highlighted by the United States and has now recommended a new Washington consensus, as the previous Washington consensus has not only led to the loss of jobs and capacity, moving away from essential industries like that of semiconductors and infrastructure, and giving a boost to the economic might of China, which has led to the flexing of muscles in the geopolitical domain also. And this is the reason that US is now suggesting a new five-fold policy framework under the new Washington consensus. Now, this five-fold policy framework and the new Washington consensus is also favorable for India to further give a boost to its partnership with the United States of America. The first steps as suggested under the new policy framework under the new Washington consensus is the return to the industrial policy that was the hallmark of US economic development. And for this purpose, US wants to restore the primacy of state. And for this purpose, US is pumping investments into the semiconductor production and for promotion and development of green technologies. Apart from the return to the industrial policy, the US is pushing for joint effort, and this will be favorable for both India and United States. Now, US in its effort under the new Washington consensus is not promoting protectionism. Rather, US is focusing on joint partnership with its allies, including India. The third pillar under the new Washington consensus is to go beyond the traditional policies, wherein the US is pushing for more open policies as suggested under the IPEF, that is the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, wherein US is allowing countries to join or not to join any of the pillars that may be apprehensive of. So rather than focusing on the traditional policies of tariff oriented or reduction of tariffs among the member countries, US is now pushing for beyond traditional policies, wherein it is focusing on policies that are to be adopted by the member countries and partnerships that can be entered into the member countries where they have the flexibility of to joining or not to join any of the pillars under the new Washington consensus, as it was seen in the IPEF case where India has decided not to join the trade pillar. So this highlights the flexibility in the US approach, wherein it wants countries to partner as per the convenience and their developmental level. The next step taken by the US under the new Washington consensus is to mobilize investment as an alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative, as US is now mobilizing trillions of dollars in investment into the emerging economies, and with full flexibility of tailor guiding or tailor making the solution as per the demand of the countries. And this is seen as an alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative, which has led to the debt crisis in many countries. Apart from that, US is also pushing for the reform of multilateral development banks, so to emerge as an alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative. At the last, US is also pushing for a new export control regime. under the new export control regime, US wants to develop new export control mechanisms and regulation such that it will limit the national security threats from China and any other rivals that the US may have. So these were the reforms that are suggested under the new Washington Consensus by the US. And it primarily involves partnership and flexibility as the key ingredients wherein India can also benefit from this new partnership under the joint effort, engaging in the policies that are favorable to the India like that of IPEF, and utilizing the partnership to cater to the local demands of investment, wherein US is reforming the multilateral development banks as well as mobilizing trillions of dollars of investment. And this all can be utilized by India to further a partnership with the United States of America. Further, US and India can also partner in streamlining and guiding a new export control regime wherein critical information can be shared between the two countries. So this was about the new Washington Consensus. We have also seen about the old Washington Consensus and what policies were suggested under it. We have also seen that India adopted LPG reforms in 1990s that was similar to some of the guiding principles under the Washington Consensus. Adoption of these LPG reforms also resulted in higher growth rates, but it also led to the phenomena of jobless growth in the initial years, as well as the redistribution of extra wealth in Indian context has been skewed when the effect of LPG is analyzed in the Indian context. Moving on to the next article of the day, the article has featured on Indian Express under the explained section on 18th May, and basically talks about the artificial sweetener story. Now the article talks about that WHO has released a new guideline wherein it has advised against the use of non-sugar sweeteners as an healthy alternative to sugar. Now this comes at a point when in 2015, earlier, WHO has released a guideline wherein it highlighted that the high intake of free sugars is linked to weight gain and obesity, and this guideline has led consumers to turn towards the non-sugar sweeteners. And now WHO has advised that the non-sugar sweeteners should not be seen as a healthy alternative to the sugar. We try to understand through this article the meaning of non-sugar sweeteners. And why is WHO advising against the use of non-sugar sweeteners? So the first thing to understand is what are non-sugar sweeteners? Basically, non-sugar sweeteners are marketed as low or no calorie alternative to free sugars that may aid in the weight loss and also controlling the blood glucose of the individuals who are suffering from diabetes. Now, they are widely used in ingredients in the beverages and the pre-packed food. And the examples of prominent non-sugar sweeteners are that of stevia, sucralose, saccharin, aspartame, cyclamates, advantame, asulfame K, etc. Now to understand or simplify it, we can understand it by taking examples of in and around us, wherein we can take an example of diet cola, wherein the diet cola use aspartame as a non-sugar alternative to sweeten the diet colas that have claimed to have no sugar or no calorie. Further, another example from around that is prominently used as an alternative of free sugar is in the sweetening of tea or coffee around us, and for this purpose saccharin is used. So basically we have understood that non-sugar sweeteners are low or no calorie alternatives as they are marketed against the free sugar that may aid in weight loss or controlling the blood glucose, and we have also seen the examples in and around us. But now WHO is advising against it, as WHO have conducted trials wherein they have highlighted that the higher intakes of the non-sugar sweeteners are associated with the increased risk of obesity. WHO in its study and the trial conducted has highlighted that though there could be some initial weight loss and reduction in BMI in the short term, as the artificial sweeteners bring down the calories consumed, but in the longer run, the non-sugar sweeteners are linked to have promoting the weight gain. Further, the non-sugar sweeteners could also lead to increased risk of type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, and chronic kidney diseases along with the cancer. And data is also there linking artificial sweetener to bladder cancer and preterm birth when consumed by the pregnant woman. So these are highlighted as the factors by WHO where they are discouraging the long-term use of non-sugar sweeteners as an alternative to free sugar. The Ministry of Health has decided that they will initiate discussion among the policymakers before it decides to adopt this conditional recommendation by the WHO. So with this we have understood what are non-sugar sweeteners, the examples of non-sugar sweeteners in and around us, what has WHO highlighted in the new study, wherein it has highlighted against the use of non-sugar sweeteners. And we have also discussed that in 2015 WHO has highlighted that free sugar should not be used, which led to the increase of non-sugar sweeteners consumption around the world. Moving on to the next article of the day, the article is featured in the explain section of the Indian Express on 16th May. Now this article basically talks about the new Alzheimer's drug that is in news, as this new drug is found to slow down the cognitive decline by 35% in people with the early Alzheimer's. The drug is known as donanemab and has demonstrated its efficacy in slowing down the deterioration of cognitive abilities due to the Alzheimer's disease. Now, this topic is important for us from the perspective of prelims examination in the UPSC syllabus, as UPSC in the past has also asked questions related to hereditary disease, and we can expect a question related to this disease. Now, donanemab is an investigational drug and is currently under the development to address early Alzheimer's disease. The first thing to understand here about the donanemab drug is that it falls into the antibody-based therapy, which is specifically designed to target the amyloid beta protein. Now, we'll try to understand the Alzheimer's disease. Now, the pictographic here shows a MRI scan. This MRI scan shows a shrinkage around the front and the sides of a brain of a person who was diagnosed with early onset of the Alzheimer's disease, as it is clearly visible that there is a shrinkage of both the front and the sides of a brain. Now, Alzheimer's basically is a neurodegenerative disorder that typically starts slowly and worsens over the time. Alzheimer's is responsible for 60 to 70% of the dementia case worldwide. Now, another thing to understand about the Alzheimer's is the abnormal buildup of proteins in and around the brain cell, which is particularly responsible for this disease. And the proteins involved here is that of amyloid, and the second protein involved here is that of tau. In case of amyloid, there is deposit of plaque around the brain cell, and this causes clumping to occur, having a toxic effect on the brain cells. And in case of tau, there is a deposition which tangles with the brain cell. That is, there is a change in shape of the brain cells which leads to disruption of the transport system. The end result of this abnormal buildup of protein, that is the amyloid beta and the tau protein, is that the chemical messengers or the neurotransmitters decline, which are responsible for sending messages and signals between the brain cells. And as a result, different areas of brain start shrinking, as we have already seen in the MRI pictograph. So with this, we have seen that it is the beta amyloid and the tau proteins that are responsible for basically causing a decline in the cognitive abilities, wherein it undergoes a toxic transformation, aggregating and interfering with the connections and the functioning of the brain cell. And consequently, this disruption results in cognitive problems, starting with the memory loss, with the shrinking of the front and the sides of the brain. Now, another thing to understand here about the Alzheimer's disease is the cause and the risk factors. Age is one of the prominent cause, and the people with advancing age are at the highest risk factor, with majority of cases occurring in individuals that are over 65 years of age. The next factor responsible for the Alzheimer's disease is the gene mutations that happens in certain individuals. And these gene mutations can occur in genes of that of APP, PSEN and PSEN2 that are responsible for the risk of developing Alzheimer's. The prominent cause is that related to the amyloid protein, wherein the researchers have shown that Alzheimer's disease is to be caused by abnormal buildup of amyloid beta and tau protein in and around the brain cell. At the last, some of the lifestyle factors also contribute to the increased risk of the Alzheimer's disease, which include conditions like cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, obesity, and smoking. So these were the causes and the risk factors that are associated with the onset of Alzheimer's disease, wherein the amyloid proteins play a dominant role in people affected with the Alzheimer's, but lifestyle factors like cardiovascular problems, diabetes, obesity, smoking also contributes to furthering the risk of Alzheimer's. Now, Alzheimer's can be diagnosed with variety of ways, that is through cognitive and neuropsychological tests, imaging techniques like that of MRI or PET scans, and also conducting biomarker tests like amyloid PET to detect the amyloid plaques. Currently, there is no treatment to stop or reverse its progression. At the best, what we have for the counter of Alzheimer's is to have a treatment that provides for temporary symptom improvement. Now, this brings us to the next question, that what is this new drug donanemab contributes, or the achievement of donanemab is. The study highlighted that the donanemab usage has led to 35% reduced cognitive decline. There is a 35% deacceleration in the cognitive decline in individuals who were diagnosed with early Alzheimer's disease. Secondly, the discovery is also important because it has led to preservation of daily functioning, as there was a 40% decline of individuals' ability to perform everyday tasks. There was also positive effect of drug on the intermediate of Alzheimer's disease. So this can be emerging as a potential treatment and brings the hope to the individuals who are diagnosed with the early stage of Alzheimer's. But there is also challenges in implementation or the wide scale implementation of donanemab, as donanemab along with lecanemab, which is another drug for the treatment of Alzheimer's, carry high risk of side effect, which may include symptoms like that of brain swelling, bleeding, etc. And these are highlighted as the challenges in the implementation of these drugs. So with this, we have seen what the donanemab, the new Alzheimer's drug, is, how it is beneficial for the people who are suffering from the early onset of Alzheimer's disease, also having a positive effect on the intermediate level of individuals who are suffering from Alzheimer's. Apart from that, we have also seen Alzheimer's as a neurodegenerative disorder responsible for 60 to 70% of the dementia cases. We have also seen in our discussion that Alzheimer's basically, as studied today, arises due to the abnormal buildup of proteins, that is the amyloid beta and the tau proteins, which interferes with the normal functioning of the brain, and the deposition creates a toxic effect. We have also seen the causes and the risk factor, which not only includes the toxic and the neurodegenerative effect by the amyloid proteins, but also includes some of the lifestyle factors like cardiovascular, diabetes, obesity as the prominent reasons which increases the risk of Alzheimer's.